Hello viewers. There's a pretty spicy thought experiment by the philosopher Graham Priest, which I find quite interesting, and I think you will too. It's from his book, which I believe is just called One. I'll put the details in the description of this video if you're interested. I'll be framing it in less abstract and theoretical terms than he does, because I think it helps to clarify a particular point about the problem, which I want to explore. Imagine there is an infinitely long, perfectly straight line of light bulbs. Yes, it is infinitely long. I'm afraid we're going to have to put aside any pretensions to realism here. If you're looking for believable physics, this is not the video for you. But if you can suspend your disbelief for a few minutes or so, I think you'll like the payoff. Imagine that these light bulbs are wired in such a way that if a bulb is on, the bulb to the right also comes on. That's rule one. There's another crucial bit, which is that the only way for a bulb to come on is for it to be turned on by the bulb directly to the left. There is no other way for a bulb to come on. That's rule two. You can take a gander at my masterpiece of a diagram if you like, which has been on screen for a bit. You're probably thinking, why has this guy created such a stunning piece of art for just a 10-minute YouTube video? It's like a Renaissance masterwork. And you'd be completely correct. I am an artistic genius, and anyone who tells me otherwise is clearly just jealous of my obvious talent. Now, I think this is a pretty simple setup. It's only two rules, but it gets slightly less clear-cut from here. First of all, we need to notice that the way these bulbs are wired means that they are either all on or all off. This took me a while to fully get, but it makes sense if you think about it, because if you know that there's a bulb turned on, then you also know that all the bulbs to the right of it are also on, because of rule 1. And in addition to that, you know all the bulbs to the left are on too, otherwise there would be a sort of like loose end, so to speak, and rule 2 specifically prohibits that. Basically, either every bulb is on or every bulb is off. Note that the rules do not specify which, and this will prove to be quite an important point. Now here comes the interesting part. Imagine you're about to walk into a room, and you know that on the other side of the door you're going to find this infinite line of bulbs. For the sake of simplicity, we'll assume it's not infinite in both directions, so there is a clear, first bulb, though it's not first in the causal sense. Now let's also say that the line stretches infinitely to the left, so rule 1 acts towards the right. Note that this doesn't actually change anything about the thought experiment. Anyway, you know that they're either going to be all on or all off. So imagine you open the door to find that the bulbs are all on. A very natural question to ask might be why? Why are the bulbs all on rather than all off? A more precise statement of that question might be, what is the reason or cause for the bulbs all being on? And to some people, it might seem like this has a perfectly reasonable answer. They might say, well, the first bulb is on because the second bulb is on. The second bulb is on because the third bulb is on, and so on ad infinitum. The bulb is explained by the one to the right, and in turn explains all the bulbs to the left. That is, if we know there is a bulb to kick it all off. If they're a mathematician, they might phrase it in terms of induction. So they might say, as a base case, we know that the first bulb is on, and we also know that if a bulb is on, then the bulb to the left of it must be on too. And from that we can infer that they must all be on, otherwise the first bulb would not be on. None of this is false, everything this person said is true, but it seems somehow lacking to me. It might be the fact that their answer would have worked equally well if the bulbs had all been off rather than on. It feels like they have explained why each individual bulb is the way it is in this particular scenario, but not why it's this particular scenario rather than the other one. In other words, they've explained every part without explaining the whole. This feels very paradoxical, just on an intuitive level. It seems like all you need to do to explain a whole is to explain every part of it. But for some reason this idea breaks down when applied to infinite bulbs. So what's going on here? Well, you could just bite the bullet and say that the explanation in terms of individual bulbs is as good a reason as we're ever going to get, and the whole really is explained. What some people might find controversial about this is that it seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason, which I will call the PSR from now on because I'm lazy, is a kind of law of causality, which states that everything that exists has a comprehensive reason for it being that way. Historically, it was almost universally accepted, but it's now being questioned by some philosophers. In simplest terms, the PSR is the fact that hot air rises because it is less dense than cold air, or that infants cry because they need milk. It seems pretty common sense. Nothing in our everyday lives happens without some kind of cause or reason, and it also challenges the explanation of the line of bulbs in terms of individual constituents, because the PSR is not reductionist. That is to say, its domain is not restricted to the smallest possible constituents of things. You don't need to explain every atom in a baby's body to explain why it is crying. What this means for the bulbs is that anyone who accepts the PSR is entitled to ask why it is the case that all the bulbs are on rather than off. The explanation in terms of individual bulbs fails for the following reason. Recall that for the argument to work, it needs to refer to a single bulb and then infer from the two rules that all the other bulbs must be on. It needs a base case, a bulb that can ground its inductive inference. This requires presupposing that there is in fact a bulb which is on, and this can only be the case if all the bulbs are on, as we established earlier. Either they're all on or they're all off. There's no other option. So in other words, the explanation from constituents needs to assume its conclusion in order to work, and therefore it fails. The PSR tells us, if we accept it, that the bulbs as a whole have an explanation. We've just established that it can't be simply explained in terms of constituents, so what is the explanation then? Well, this is where we run into practical difficulties. Thought experiments are fun, and they also allow us to see the edge cases which might expose serious flaws in our reasoning. But they should be used where they are most warranted, and I think we need to recognize when the implausibility of the premises of a thought experiment exceeds the limits of its usefulness. In the case of the infinite bulbs, we have basically turned what was a pure mathematical structure in Graham Priest's description into a real-world system. That has already come at the cost of the laws of physics, but I think it carries logical baggage as well. In a way, moving from the realm of abstract ideas into a more concrete setting can expose the source of the paradox in a clearer way. Consider this: if we abstract away the playful pseudo-realism of the bulbs, we are left with a mathematical structure which can either be an infinite set of zeros or an infinite set of ones, because of the way it was defined. The definition alone does not specify which. In other words, there is an ambiguity. I think we can analyze the explanatory problem as bubbling up out of a deeper fact of ambiguity in the definition. When we deal with mathematical structures subject to certain conditions, ambiguity just means we need to add more conditions to get a single structure rather than two or more possible cases. Or if we add too many conditions and they become logically inconsistent, maybe we end up with nothing. Think about it. The rules laid out in the setup of the thought experiment left open two possibilities: all on or all off. There only arose a problem when one possibility was established as the true reality without specifying why this is the case. It's basically an arbitrary choice, hence why the PSR is left unsatisfied. The question literally doesn't specify the deeper reason for the particular scenario, whilst implicitly stating that there is such a reason. This isn't really a paradox, it's just searching for information that isn't there. So of course the explanation from constituents fails, because there's information we haven't been given. I think this thought experiment is interesting because it illustrates how translating pure logic into the real world can bring into sharper focus what is actually a pretty well hidden ambiguity. I'll put a few sources in the description in case anyone is interested. Goodbye for now, viewers.